And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing low pressure here, bringing some rain into Kodiak Island that tomorrow moves northeastward here and then begins to slow down in the Gulf there. Rain for the next couple of days across the southeast coast there as it slowly edges eastward, extending back in toward the eastern North Gulf Coast area, especially Yakutat. Showers over southeast interior, increasing sunshine here due to, well, a couple of things. Lack of storminess and a little bit of an increasing presence of high pressure. Then a big storm out here over the Bering Sea, bringing increasing winds, gusts possibly 50 miles an hour with snow, trending toward rain throughout the day on Tuesday, and wind and rain all the way down here into the eastern and central Aleutians. Coastal water forecast there for the southeast coast tomorrow on the south coast. South winds 25 knots, southeast 25 on the central coast, and east winds 25 knots from the north coast. Seas running 7 to 8 feet. Lynn Canal, south winds 20 knots, south at 30 knots for Stevens Passage with 4-foot seas. Southeast 20 knots with 4-foot seas for Clarence Strait. And then for Tuesday, lighter winds over the inside channels here, anywhere from the south or southeast at 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 3 foot seas. Lighter winds also out here along the coast, 10 to 15 knots from the south-southwest down to the south. Central coastal areas looking at a south to southeast wind at 10 to 15 knots. East 10 to 15 knots for the north coast. And for Cook Inlet tomorrow, variable winds 10 knots. Variable winds 10 knots for Kamishak Bay. Northwest winds 20 knots for the Barren Islands and the western North Gulf Coast. East side over here, Middleton Island, and that area looking at east winds at 20 knots with 5-foot seas. Prince William Sound, east winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. And not much change for the Sound on Tuesday. Winds still east at 15 knots, call it 2 foot in the seas there. Variable winds 10 to 15 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, variable at 10 for the western North Gulf Coast. Cook Inlet, west to southwest breeze at 10 knots, especially in the afternoon hours, and west 20 knots, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. And for Kodiak Island, north to northeast winds for Monday, 15 to 20 knots. Alaska Peninsula, north to northwest winds 15 to 25 knots. And Bristol Bay, a light west wind at 10 knots with 2-foot seas. And for the Bay on Tuesday, west winds 15 knots there with 3-foot seas. West-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, seas running 3 feet. And for Kodiak Island, west-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots with seas at 5 to 6 feet. Eastern Aleutians, north winds 20 to 25 knots, northwest 20 knots for Adak and Atka, and small craft advisories for the western Aleutians for southwest to northwest winds at 20 to 30 knots. And then gale warnings coming into the picture with that big storm that's farther to the north there. West-southwest winds for the western Aleutians at 40 knots with seas as high as 20 to 23 feet. Gale warnings pushing into Adak, Atka, and eventually in toward Nikolsky throughout the day from the southwest at 35 knots. On Alaska Island, south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Seas there 5 to 6 feet. And for the southwest coast, tomorrow, north to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest south of Nunivak Island. West-northwest winds at 15 knots for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island. Southwest 20 for St. Matthew Island, north 15 for the Pribilofs. And for the day on Tuesday, throughout the afternoon, or into the afternoon hours, actually throughout the day, these winds coming up, gales by afternoon. 40 knots from the south, 12 to 18-foot seas here from the Pribilofs up to St. Matthew Island. St. Lawrence Island south winds increasing to 30 knots. Along the coast, south winds 25 to 30 knots, south 25 for Norton Sound. And for the Chukchi tomorrow, west-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots. Western Arctic coast, pretty light winds out of the northeast at 10 knots. North at 10 for the Central coast, eastern Boulevard Sea coast, light north breeze at about 5 knots. And then for Tuesday, eastern Boulevard Sea coast, east-southeasterlies 5 to 10 knots. South at 15 for the Central Arctic coast, western Arctic coast south at 10. And then brisk wind advisories here for the Chukchi Sea for south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots.